Okay, I just wanted to review again Basil J. Hiley's another posthumously published talk that he gave in 2022, and so it was published 3 years after his passing. And the question is, why did it take so long to get published? But regardless, he says, I'm just a grumpy old man. This is a grumpy old man speaking, so he's clearly frustrated in 2022. So then I found his final talk on YouTube in the end of March in 2024, and he's in discussion with Sir Roger Penrose, who was somebody he had been having discussions with throughout his career in physics. And he says, I don't understand why you, Roger, don't understand what I'm saying. And they're discussing, Basil J. Hiley was discussing why there is no collapse of the wave function if you truly understand quantum physics. So we can see here that clearly Professor Hiley was frustrated that Roger Penrose was not willing to acknowledge the non-commutativity, but ironically, Roger Penrose did publish how the foundation of his palatial twister model is non-commutativity, but he was given that explanation by another mathematician that he co-published with, and that mathematician also has passed on recently, as did Basil J. Hiley. So I just wanted to go back to, before I cover these final talks by Basil J. Hiley, I wanted to discuss an earlier talk of his from 2015 when he was more hopeful. He was starting a new collaboration with Professor Robert Flack based on the weak measurements. And he mentions how this hydrodynamics was used as sort of like a new pilot wave model of a single particle. So you're showing this guidance of the single particle by a non-local field. And as Basil J. Hiley says in his talk, why hydrodynamics of a single particle? That's the puzzle. Or is it just buried in the non-commutative mathematics, which is what I believe it is. So in his talk, he's pointing out you have this is the what they're calling modular momentum in the weak measurement experiments of entangled photons, and it's experimental proof of what David Bohm and Basil J. Hiley explained as this non-local dynamic that's guiding the particle. And so, as Basil J. Hiley explains, the reason this understanding of the foundation of reality has been ignored in physics, even though it's been experimentally demonstrated numerous times, is that as somebody published, the linear operator is merely Well, they wrote that the local mean velocity has no true quantum mechanical significance since it cannot be expressed as the expectation value of any linear operator. So Basil J. Hiley responds that the linear operator is merely a representation of a much deeper structure, namely the non-commutative algebraic structure. So in other words, because the wrong algorithm has been used in quantum physics, and because people have learned the wrong mathematics, therefore they're not able to confront the non-local truth of reality, and this is why nonlocality remains misunderstood in quantum physics. And so in his latest talk published on YouTube, which is actually from 3 years ago, Basil J. Hiley says everything goes at 2-point functions. So we, in commutative geometry science, we have been trying to do everything at a point, at 1 point. And so when you have 2 points, if x1 can be the past and then x2 can be the future. And this means that you don't have time plus 3 spatial dimensions. You have time plus another dimension. So for each point, it has its own time. And so the time is not measured externally as a parameter. It's a time energy uncertainty or time frequency uncertainty. And so that makes the time that we're embedded inside the time as an organic process. And that's why Basil J. Hiley and David Bohm both emphasize that it's not mechanics, it's not quantum mechanics, but it's an organic process that we exist within. And so the commutative standard mathematics can exist again at h bar squared, but within that it's non-commutative. And so the quantum mechanics is not random. This is a quote from Basil J. Hiley. Because of this non-commutative, non-local process going on. So when he's describing this non-commutative process, here's an earlier paper where they get into the mathematics that's originally from the 1800s to late the 1880s. And basically, he says that this non-commutative process is fundamental to his work and math professor Luke Hoffman, as well as Roger Penrose. So that's why he was so frustrated that Roger Penrose refused to acknowledge what Basil J. Hiley was explaining as there being no need for a quantum collapse. And so so he explains the mathematics is just what they call the inner multiplication of the matrices. So it's an algebraic non-commutative process. And I understand this through music theory, as I've explained numerous times, so I'm not going to get into the music theory, but Alon Khan also relies on the same music theory secret that I had discovered on my own. And so that's how he's developing the non-commutative algebraic process through this mathematics. And So basically, there's no control at this level because of the non-locality, but you can still explain it in the total non-commutative algebra. So when you do when you diagonalize them in one representation as your matrix mathematics, you don't do it in the other representation, and so you have a non-commutative process that's going on in the experiment that's non-local. And so what he was doing in his final work was relating this to a symplectic topology, which is essentially, my guess would be that's like the non-commutative tori that my own quantum physics professor Herbert J. Bernstein was working with. So in this talk from 3 years ago, he's talking with a philosopher of science who refers to Schelling, because Basil J. Hiley says he was influenced by Schelling, and so he mentions, the philosopher of science mentions this paper about Schelling being an inspiration for the first discovery of electromagnetism. And so then in this talk, Basil J. Hiley, he comes out and says that science is using the wrong mathematical structure. And so he's basically challenging all of modern physics based on commutative geometry. And then he says that he wishes he could find people to work with him, but they get put out by the bigwigs, meaning their supervisors say, no, you won't get your PhD if you go down that road. But he had the privilege of working with David Bohm in the 60s when they had freedom to do serious investigations. And now we seem to make our youngsters go through course after course after course, and they become experts as soon as you take them off the ideas that they were told to them by the course. For example, the Clifford algebra process, they are utterly bewildered. They are utterly bewildered, and it's very sad. So that's why he's a grumpy old man. And so then when he does this final talk of his in the end of March 2024, you can tell the person, one of the presenters, the moderator of the forum, keeps insisting that quantum physics has to be random, that there's an inherent randomness. But Basil J. Hiley already said in 2022 that quantum mechanics is not random. So you have this problem with, it's the same exact problem that he just talked about, where people are taking all these classes to become experts, and they're not really challenging the fundamental ideas of quantum physics. So he's not even able to communicate his ideas anymore because people are so hindered by their assumptions, the wrong presumptions. And once again, he says that they've discovered this extra energy, which we call the quantum potential energy. And so the problem is that the Schrodinger equation and the matrix mechanics as it is, use an algorithm that's not reflecting what's actually taking place, because they're considered equivalent based on the unitary operation, but that identity matrix is covering up the non-commutative algebra. And so his whole point was to do these argon and helium experiments with the experimentalist physicist Robert Flack, to show that the quantum potential in the weak measurements then is the weak value of the kinetic energy of mass. And and he says that this would also explain the inflation of the universe when he worked it out, that there's no kinetic energy when it's just pure quantum potential energy. It's this non-commutative, non-local force that's the origin of the inflation of the universe. So this was the final frustration of Professor Basil J. Hiley, that when the pandemic set in, they got their experiment shut down and they lost their funding to do the experiment. And Basil J. Hiley said he was working on a book about his final research, and it's basically a revolutionary book that changes the whole foundation of physics, of reality. And so I emailed Professor Robert Flack to ask him if he could find out about this book and try to get the book published. And so so when he says we have two dimensions, time plus another dimension, what he's really referring to here is the time and frequency non-commutativity being not non-local. And this is what I had emailed Professor Basil J. Hiley about originally, about 7 years ago. I just pointed out, time and frequency are non-commutative, and so he knows that, like he says, that the photon needs to be understood as having this non-local, non-commutative energy to it, or a momentum. And essentially it's like that would be like the virtual photon that's non-local. And his whole point was, well, he's not sure if this is true for particles, and he wanted to prove that doing the weak measurements, that this is not due to gravity, that it's a underlying non-commutative phase space that exists before space-time with gravity. So there, you can prove that by using particles with mass. And so that's pretty much it. And so it's pretty fascinating that Roger Penrose and some other a lot of the physicists, they just were not willing to engage with Professor Basil J. Hiley's ideas because of this non-commutative mathematics. And as being the explanation for this newly discovered force. And so that, of course, gets us into quantum biology, where he published in 2022 with the Finnish neuroscientist that this non-commutativity also completely changes quantum biology, because if you don't have the collapse of the wave function, you're able to maintain the non-commutativity into the macro scale. And that's the secret of the paranormal that Basil J. Hiley then said people would be afraid to consider that. And it's also the secret of negative entropy. And somebody was just checking out my research on Olivier Costa de Beauregard, who focused on the paranormal in regards to his mentor Louis de Broglie, who had this original hydrodynamic model of the pilot wave. And Olivier Costa de Beauregard was looking at the Ritz-Rydberg combination principle from Heisenberg and pointing out that Ritz was having a discussion with Einstein about how this Ritz-Rydberg combination principle proved that there's a negative entropy to reality. And so that's, again, the secret of the non-commutative mathematics that Heisenberg discovered in the algebra of the Ritz-Rydberg combination principle, which is basically the spectroscopy measurements of light